policymaking, the role of the UN, for instance, in genocide awareness and prevention and intervention, that master's program would be something for you as well. So I know, just from being here for these years and knowing Myrna and all the good people involved in this program, that you're learning a ton in this course, you're being challenged by it, you're enjoying it, and if it's something you want to continue after here, you're starting to see the explosion of graduate level interest in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. So what I want to do with you today is talk to you a little bit about some of the main arguments I make in the book, Coming Evil, think with you about the issue of who is it that commits the type of extraordinary evil we see in cases of genocide and mass atrocity. We'll talk a little bit about definitions of genocide and mass atrocity, and then I want to finish up, though, with a discussion of some of the work that I do with the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, because obviously if you choose to work in a field like this, a lot of what you'll do will be focused on issues of policymaking, intervention, hopefully genocide prevention, and I have the opportunity to go 4 times a year to Poland and teach at Auschwitz U.S. military personnel and government policymakers about what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and what they can do to stand up and make a difference in the face of genocidal violence. So I have a very brief video clip at the end today that I can show you that will describe a little bit of that work. Let's start here, though. One would think, I'm not sure if the clicker's working. There we go. Cain and Abel, the 2 sons of Adam and Eve, the first family, literal first family in these traditional understandings. Cain and Abel make a sacrifice to Yahweh or God, and for whatever reason, probably has to do with intention or motivation, God looks with favor upon Abel's sacrifice and with disfavor upon Cain's sacrifice. And the Hebrew Scriptures then go on to say that at some point in the future, this is what you see in the picture, Cain falls upon his brother Abel in the field and kills him. Now, I've known this story for as long as I know stories, but the importance of it never really hit me until several years ago when I read something by Ada Wiesel that points out there are only 2 men, really, in history at this point. 2 men, and one of them become a killer. And Wiesel's point is, in the Jewish, Christian, Islamic traditions, Western understanding of human nature, this is the first time death appears in the world. Now think about that a little for a moment. Try and get your mind around it. I mean, death could have made its first appearance any number of ways. Famine, pestilence, plague, a natural disaster like we've seen recently in Japan, heart attack, the most common way death comes into the world, simply through accident. But here, in these traditions, the first time death makes its appearance, it's in the form of murder. And I think in many ways you can argue that this understanding kind of sets us off on an understanding of what human nature is like throughout history. And part of our human nature, part of our interactions with each other, have been a pretty consistent pattern of intergroup conflict. I've given you a few data points here if you can read them. Since the Napoleonic Wars, we fought an average of 6 civil wars and 6 international wars per decade. 3 high-fatality struggles going on anywhere in the world at any moment since 1900. In conflictology, high fatality is described as the loss of life of 1,000 or more people. So pick any year since 1900, any month of that year, any day of that month, any hour of that day, any minute of that hour, an average of 3 high-fatality struggles going on somewhere in the world. Since the end of World War II, 150 wars, only 26 days of world peace. Today, actually, more than a third of the world's 193 nations are embroiled in conflict. That's a level almost twice, the Cold War level. Now, when I see this slide, I think of 3 quotes that go with it to help me understand conflict in human history. One quote comes from Leon Trotsky, and Trotsky's quote is this: "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." What does he mean by that? That's a question to you, actually. I'm not just talking to myself. What does he mean by that? You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Yes?
Someone's going to benefit by this war. Like something's going to be taken from on you, or you're going to serve a purpose?
Yeah, it's going to impact you somehow, some way. So even if you're sitting here and you spent your career sitting on the stage saying, I'm not interested in Afghanistan, Iraq, war, anywhere. I'm about peace, I'm about nonviolence, I just don't care about war. You don't really have that luxury. Because even if you're not interested, war is interested in you. Your life has changed because of our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Your life has changed because of the reality of war throughout the world. So you don't really have the luxury as a citizen of this world of saying, I don't care about war. I'm not interested. The point is, it's interested in you, and it's impacting you in a ton of different ways. Second quote I think about when I see the slide comes from Winston Churchill, who said, the story of the human race is war. What does that mean? The story of the human race is war. Stephanie? Oh, there's like 100 people here. No one's named Stephanie? So, anyone, don't make me call out random names. Ashley. Story of the human race is war. I think what Churchill's, yeah, go ahead.
That history is told through conflict, and history of nation states is the history of war and conflict.
Yeah, history's told through conflict, right. If Dr. Goodman gave you an assignment and said, you need to write the history of the world, that's a hard assignment, just imagine. The history of the world, but you can only do it through one perspective. What's the best lens that would give us the best understanding of why we have the nation states we have, why we have the language distributions we have, why we have the distributions of diseases we have? I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to find a better lens than war. And if I had to write that paper for Dr. Goodman, I'd write it from the viewpoint of war, because that will get us, I think, closest to understanding how we are the way we are today. And the third quote I think of when I see this slide comes from Plato. Plato said, only the dead have seen the end of war. What does he mean by that? Yes?
That we're always going to have war.
Yeah, we're always going to have war. Again, get your mind around that. Of all the things in your life that will change, the one constant will remain. You're always going to live in a time of war. Even if your country isn't at war, you're going to live in a time of war somewhere in the world. Some of you are of an age that you're dangerously close to being able to say, you've not lived in this country without war. Okay? So, this is an uncomfortable reality, right? But this is the one constant. If you bring back your great-great-great-grandparents, all the things you can't talk about, iPods, iPads, music, all the things that are different, fashion, gender roles, everything else, there would be one thing you could talk about and probably have some constancy, and that's war and conflict. They would have been impacted by war in some of the same ways you've been impacted by war as well. Next slide, please. And there's some literal truth to Plato's comment that only the dead have seen see the end of war, because so many people died because of war and conflict. In the 20th century, over 100 million people died because of war. That's 5 times the amount from the 19th century, 10 times the amount from the 18th century. Sometimes people see the slide and they say, well, that increase is only because of technology. We've developed better weaponry that can kill more people in a quicker period of time with less effort. Part of that is true. But even if you took out the effects of technology, we've simply involved ourselves in more and more conflict than we have in previous human history. So even if we took out the effects of technology, you'll still see an upward steep climb here because we've just been involved in more conflict than we have at any time in human history. Now what's striking about this, and this isn't important to me, I ran across this a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's absolutely true, it's a vital fact, is the changing nature of who is victimized by war. At the beginning of the 20th century, early 1900s, 90% of war-related deaths were soldiers. If you are a civilian, you're pretty well protected. 90% of people who are going to die in war in the early 1900s were going to be soldiers who had enlisted for the purpose of fighting the war in most cases. Now let's fast forward to the 21st century, where we're at right now. 90% of people who die in war today are civilians. Almost always women and children. The most dangerous person to be in war today is a civilian woman or a civilian child. The safest person to be in war is military personnel. So this increase, tremendous increase in civilian deaths raises for us obviously some huge human rights issues and problems related to war and conflict. Next slide, please. So what happens when the boundaries, and again it's a very gray boundary, it's very fuzzy, but the boundary between war and genocide becomes crossed. Let me give you a couple ways to think about this. In war, you have quote unquote acceptable military conduct. One military fighting another military. There are rules of war. There are conventions of war. There are customs of war. But what happens in genocide is you take a step into another category entirely, where you have a military force or a state carrying out atrocities against civilians, and most often their own civilians. So when you cross that line between military fighting military to military killing civilians, you cross the line from quote-unquote acceptable warfare to genocide. Here's another way to think about it. When people ask issues of human rights, they're asking issues about to have. Okay? If you're interested in human rights, you want women to have the right to vote. In the American South, you wanted blacks to have the right to vote. There are issues of to have, that all people ought to have certain rights, and that's incredibly important. But genocide is not a to have issue. Genocide is a to be issue. Genocide is not about having rights. Genocide is about existence. So when a regime violates human rights, they are taking things from, what's your name? Hannah? They are taking things from Hannah that she has a right to have. I didn't mean to wake you, I'm sorry. You can go back to sleep. No big deal. They're taking things from Hannah that she has a right to have. But when a regime decides to commit genocide, they take away her right to be, to exist. Do you see the difference there? And when a regime has made that decision, that they're going to take away the right of the group to be, they've made a decision to commit genocide. Now, you know from being in this course that we've only had the word genocide since 1944 when Raphael Lemkin coined the word in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. But the phenomenon of genocide certainly predated the coining of the term itself. So if we look, for instance, we see the destruction of the native Southwest African population in present-day Namibia by German colonial forces in 1904. The murder of 1.5 million Armenians by Turks between 1915 and 1923. Armenia is one of the genocides you study in this course. This is an important time for us because we're coming up on April 24th, which is the Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day, and we have a president, President Obama, who pledged in his campaign, promised the Armenian community that he would call the events of 1915, 1923 what they were, genocide. When he was a senator, Senator Obama pushed President Bush to call it genocide. President Bush never did. President Obama now has said he will do it. So far, he's had 2 April 24th, and he's over 2. The third one's coming up. He'll have 2 more, maybe have 6 more, but he's got a couple of chances here left to do what he pledged to do in his campaign. But again, sometimes when you study genocide, you can kind of get lost and think, well, I'm studying history, I don't understand the relevance. Here's a great example. This has huge geopolitical relevance today. Why is he afraid to call it genocide? He's afraid to call it genocide because of Turkey's reaction. And Turkey's an important ally for us in the Middle East. It's a home to dozens of military bases for us. And Turkey is actually okay with this being referred to as atrocities, human rights violations, murder. but they don't want the G word applied to it. And if the G word's applied to it by the president, it's going to have huge political ramifications. So on April 24th of this year, watch the news. You will either hear Turkey up in arms, literally, because President Obama has fulfilled his pledge to call it genocide, or you'll hear Armenian Americans upset again that President Obama now, for a third time, has refused to do what he promised to do. And maybe even more locally, where has Kobe Bryant figured into this today? That came out of the blue, didn't it? Where's Kobe Bryant figure into it? Just to show you again the continuing relevance of it. Kobe Bryant is trying to make a comeback in terms of advertising, public relations campaigns. And one of the groups he signed on to be the spokesperson for is Turkish Airlines. When Kobe Bryant made that decision, Armenians in America, led actually by the Kardashian sisters, that's a nice connection for you, have come to the front and said, you can't do this. You can't sign on for a government-sponsored airline for a government that still continues to deny a genocide that they perpetrated almost 100 years ago. So when people say that the events of 100 years ago in Armenia are simply events of history, they're not at all. They're events that we still track today, and they're events that still leave traces on us today. Soviet man-made famines in Ukraine in 1932-33, estimated 6 to 10 million Ukrainian peasants died in this implementation of a artificial man-made famine. This is something I've actually been reading quite about just recently because I really didn't know that much about Ukraine, but increasing great amounts of research are starting to come out. But you're talking about famines here where, again, Stalin requisitions grain from the Ukraine. So it's not that they can't produce it, they produce it, but Stalin takes it to take back to Moscow in the interior of Russia. And then he makes Ukrainian kulaks, peasants, stay on their farms. He doesn't allow them to travel places to get food. So it's not like we had some drought and food and grain wasn't available. It was just taken away from a group of people that Stalin felt were too political, were too nationalistic. 6 to 10 million of them died in a 2-year period. 2,505 confirmed convicted cases of cannibalism, of parents dismembering their children who starved to death and boiling them in soup to try and live. 2,505 convicted cases. How many cases do you think there actually were that don't come to court? I mean, you start to see the toll this takes on the human population, and the Ukraine has been one of the cases of what I would argue to be genocide that is just now receiving increasing amounts of attention. Certainly the Holocaust of 1939 to 45, you're most familiar with, 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews lose their lives in this 6-year period. This is also a great time to be in this class because coming up shortly we will have the commemoration of Yom Shoah, the Holocaust remembrance for the international community. And at the end of all of this, and this is kind of interesting where it starts, Rollo Hilberg, a famous Holocaust historian, says he first saw this in Buchenwald at the end of the war. At the end of all of this 2-word phrase comes up, never again. And if you ever have a chance to visit the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you can buy never again on t-shirts, on bumper stickers, on necklaces, on small rocks, and it's a wonderfully catchy phrase, right? It's a perfect catchphrase. The problem has been there's no truth to it. I mean, never again only has meaning, one journalist says, if by never again you mean never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what it means, it's fine. But really, never again means ever again. It means again and again and again. Next slide, please. So we see since the end of the Holocaust, genocide and mass killings in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Nepal. Again, we're not going to go through those case by case, obviously, but I want you to have some sense that there's not a corner of the world that hasn't been touched by genocidal violence. It's not located in one place at one time in history to one people. We're talking about something here, to go back to the story of Cain and Abel, that's just part of human history. It's part of how we have related or misrelated to each other over the course of time. If you look at the 20th century, the 1900s, and you estimate the death tolls from genocide alone, the estimates run about 60 million. 60 million people who trusted their state to protect them, but their state gave away that responsibility and instead decided to kill them. 60 million people who thought they were safe because they were citizens of the state, but the state turns around and decides to kill them. I mean, understand, for people like myself and Myrna and others who work in Holocaust and genocide studies, there are a lot of pressing problems in the world, and you never want to minimize those. But you also look at a lot of those problems that draw people's interest, and you say, which of those problems lead to the loss of life of 60 million people in 1 century? Not many of them. I mean, this is one of the worst disasters, human-made, human-constructed, human-inflicted disasters that we inflict on ourselves. And again, as we'll talk about at the end of today, the 21st century certainly hasn't suggested we've made a turn to the positive there. Next slide, please. So the general principle I work from, and if you've read the book, and I'll go out on a limb and say some of you haven't quite got a chance to do it yet, maybe 2 or 3, but let me read it if you haven't read it. General principle I work from is this: that political, social, religious groups who want to commit mass murder do. There'll be a lot of other obstacles they have to overcome, but they don't have to worry about finding the people to carry out the killing. So let's unpack this a little bit. If you're a group in power, and you decide there's another group of Hamas living in your midst that you no longer wish to be, you don't want this group to live, what's going to stand in your way between you and killing them? I mean, what obstacles are you going to have to overcome to implement this mass murder? What do you think? I'm sorry? A lot? The law? Okay, the law, hopefully. Okay, maybe even if your own nation state doesn't have law, we now have international law and treaty from the UN that says you can't do this. And if you do it, you will be prosecuted. So you should have to worry about the law, and we hope you have to worry about the law. You probably have to worry about resistance from the victim group. That the Hamas are going to stand up and say, we don't want to be killed. I mean, we're going to fight back, we're going to do something, but we're not going to go easily. You may have to worry about resistance from other people in your country that say, you know, we're not thrilled with the Hamas either, but you can't kill them. We don't go about doing that. Good Germans don't do that. Good Americans don't do that. Good Libyans don't do that. We can't just kill an innocent group of people. You hopefully have to worry that the international community would come in and step in and say, no, you can't do this. Now, unfortunately, just when you and I, the international community is not that quick to do it. You probably don't have to worry about that, but in theory, you should have to worry about it. But here's the one thing you don't have to worry about: finding the men and women to carry out the killing. Isn't that kind of wrong? I mean, wouldn't you want to live in a world that a regime comes to power who wants to commit genocide, and at some point they have to throw their hands up and say, as much as we'd love to kill this group of people, we just can't find the people to carry it out. We've never had a regime stop short of genocide for that reason. They've never had to worry about finding the people to carry out mass murder. Now, I'm not talking here about architects, the people who make decisions. I'm not talking about mid-level bureaucrats who push papers like an Adolf Eichmann who gets trains running on time. I'm talking about rank and file, like you see in this photo, of people who pull the triggers, of people who swing the machete, of people who swing the masu, the clubs in Rwanda with nails driven through them, of the killers in Armenia who swing the spades and shovels and hoes and whatever the pitchfork is for, whatever they can pick up to do the killing. The rank and file. Now again, if we didn't find those people, genocide wouldn't happen, right? You can have all the architects you want, all the bureaucrats you want. If you don't find someone to swing a machete and hack people to death, 800,000 Rwandans aren't going to die in 100 days. So the question for me is who are these people? Where do these people come from? This is the pressing question. Because if we can stop that level of recruiting those killers, we don't have to worry about lunatics and madmen that come to power, because they're going to have a hard time finding people to carry out the killing. One of the things I want you to remember from today is this simple phrase: humans are the weapons of genocide. Okay? We're the ones who do it. I mean, don't get caught up in technology and bureaucracy and machetes and everything else. At the end of the day, it's humans killing other humans in large numbers over an extended period of time. That's the heart of the problem. How can we stop humans from doing that to other humans? Next slide, please. So my two research questions are these. How many people does it take to carry out genocide mass killing? This is impossible to really get a firm estimate on, because again, when we go for justice after genocide, we go for the architects, we go for the bureaucrats, we go for a couple of famous rank and file killers, but most often we're going for the architects of genocide, and that's fine. But what it means is the rank and file, the people who actually killed, they go back to doing whatever they did before the conflict started. They're very seldom going to be brought to justice. So when I visit Rwanda, and you'll hear from Carl Wilkins in a few weeks as well, when you visit Rwanda and you walk the streets with victims, it's not uncommon at all for you to be walking in conversation with someone who survived the genocide as Tutsi, and he or she becomes quiet. As you pass by someone on the street, they may start to shake. I've seen people faint, and they just passed by a perpetrator. They passed by someone who killed their family. Maybe they passed by someone who raped them, infected them with HIV. Maybe they passed by someone who tried to kill the family or didn't offer rescue when they could have offered rescue. But it's a relatively small country. It's the size of Vermont. I mean, people's memories here from '94 are obviously still very fresh. And get the idea here is that most of these people who killed escape justice. Very seldom do they serve time. One of the phrases I think I used in the book, if I didn't, I'll use it next time, is the phrase, genocide overwhelms justice. That genocide involves so many people that it's hard for the justice system to keep up with it. I still go to Rwanda and interview alleged perpetrators awaiting trial for what they did in 1994. That's 17 years ago, and they still haven't got to trial. The justice system can't keep up with it. And they don't even know when they finally get to trial if the 17 years they've waited to get a trial date will count as time served or not. Rwanda's not even sure of that. So you see here how genocide can just kind of overwhelm justice. So all we can do is kind of make some rough guesses at number of perpetrators. In Holocaust, we suspect upwards of 500,000 Germans, Ukrainians, Slavs involved in the killing of 6 million Jews. In Rwanda, I think the best estimates are about 250,000 Rwandans involved face-to-face killing. When I first visited Rwanda, a colleague there told me that he thought 1 million Rwandans were involved as perpetrators. That's kind of incredible because the genocide took 800,000 lives in 100 days. And again, think about that for a moment. 800,000 people in 100 days. Auschwitz, at its highest functioning capacity, never came close to that amount of death in 100 days. 800,000 people, 100 days, a frenzy of killing. And my first trip there, my colleague says, I think 1 million people were involved in the killing because so much of the killing was done by groups of people ganging up on 1 or 2 victims. Now, in truth, it turns out that's overestimation, but you still got 250,000, 250,000 people who have been involved in the front lines of killing, who have swung machete, who have swung lasso, in some relatively few cases, have shot guns and killed people in the context of a Rwandan genocide. Bosnia-Herzegovina, the genocide of Srebrenica, that genocide of 8,000 Muslim men and boys, it's anticipated that about 15,000 Bosnian Serbs were involved in some level, some way, shape, or form at those particular slaughters and those particular killings in July of 1995. So however you cut it, the bottom line is it takes an awful lot of people at the front lines of killing to carry out what one scholar has called the hard work of mass murder. Because it is hard work to kill this many people in relatively short periods of time. So second question, who are these how are they enlisted to do this? Where do these people come from? How do you find them? How do you convince people to kill and slaughter in these ways? Now again, I'm not the first person to ever ask that question, so let's look at a few people who have given some answers that I found less than satisfying. Many people have focused on the idea, when you talk about extraordinary evil of people who commit genocide, that there must be some extraordinary reason for it. Now this is perfectly understandable. Murray mentioned in the introduction, I'm a social political psychologist by training, so I taught intro psych for centuries, it felt like at times. But in intro psych, if you've taken it, you know that it's perfectly understandable that when you see an extraordinary event, you assume an extraordinary cause. That's just how our mind works. But what we have to challenge ourselves with here today is say, is that always true? And again, these answers up here on the slide now are from people who've said, here's the extraordinary event of people committing genocide. There has to be an extraordinary cause. So what's the extraordinary causes they pointed to? Some of them have pointed to the nature of the collective, that when groups of people get together, these people argue, bad things always happen. That anytime you bring a group of people together, morals slip, morality slip, some nasty things happen. You probably have been at parties where you've seen some of this dynamic take place. Maybe you've perpetrated it, maybe you're victimized by it, but I think you have some intuitive understanding of sometimes groups come together and some pretty nasty things happen. But you've also been part of groups that have done incredible good. I mean, you've been part of groups that are at the heart of our most humane, caring, cooperative, nonviolent social institutions. And I think we have to be careful in saying groups always lead bad, because I think what groups do is they exaggerate the tendencies of people in them. You get a group of 10 people who are pretty nasty people together, that group's going to be a pretty nasty group. You bring together 10 good, cooperative, caring people, that group's going to be capable of some incredible goodness as well. So I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced about how we understand the group. Other people have said, well, the extraordinary connection is ideology. What someone believes drives these behaviors. And again, I think we have to be careful here because we're used to thinking what I believe determines how I behave. But in truth, one of the things we know in social psychology is that very often how I behave affects what I believe. And you'll see this very often when I interview perpetrators, and I've done face-to-face interviews with perpetrators in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. I very seldom see perpetrators talking about beliefs as the cause of their behaviors. What I see them describe is, I started killing for whatever reason, and over time, because of the killing, I started to hate Muslims. Over time, because of the killing, I really started to hate Tutsis. And what they're saying is, ideology was important, but it didn't cause the killing. It was the consequence of the killing. Let me give you, by the way, another example connected to it. The example would be racism and slavery in the U.S. Was racism the cause of slavery? That belief, did it cause that behavior? Most scholars in American history would say no. It's the opposite. Slavery developed as an economic system, and then to justify slavery, racism develops as an excuse or as a reason for it. And I think that's where we have to be careful about understanding the role of ideology. Then finally, extraordinary individuals. And I think this is most common. First day of class, Dr. Goodman had asked you to write an essay about what leads people to commit genocide and mass killing and mass atrocity. Chances are, most of you coming into the class would have said, these are people who are pathological. They're mentally ill, they're mentally disturbed, or at the very least, they have some twisted personality flaw, or set of personality characteristics. And the book, I talk about this as the Mad Nazi thesis and the Bad Nazi thesis. And to be honest with you, if you fall asleep in that particular chapter, that's fine. I fell asleep right in it. I mean, it's a boring chapter, it's hard to stay with, it's a long, complex story, but in truth, again, the short of it is, for all we've looked, and we've looked for pathology and personality to explain perpetrators of genocide, we've not found it. I mean, perpetrators of genocide actually probably are less pathological than the general rates of pathology in the population. Try some reason to believe that. Perpetrators of genocide don't share a common personality characteristic. They weren't all abused as children. They're not all dominant. They're not all submissive. They're not all religious. They're not all non-religious. I mean, it's just a wide range of personality characteristics that we see. So, thank you. So, next slide, please. So, what it leads me to is my central argument of the book and my work that continues is it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide and mass killing or genocide and mass atrocity. And sometimes when we use that phrase, mass atrocity, that's kind of a big umbrella phrase. And mass atrocity includes genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Ethnic cleansing, you often hear, is not really a legal category, but we do have laws against genocide, against war crimes, against crimes against humanity. And generally speaking, that's what we talk about when we talk about mass atrocity. Now, this is a very difficult argument to admit, to understand, to absorb. What's difficult about it? I mean, why would you find yourself resisting this argument that it's ordinary people like you and me who do this work? Yes?
You don't want to admit the people in this classroom who commit genocide?
Exactly. Now, this is interesting. Many people would say, you don't want to think you yourself could do it. And that's true. But his point is equally true. You also don't want to think that the people sitting next to you would be capable of it, right? And we kind of jump to other people first and say, you know, what's hard about this argument is I look around here and I don't want to have to be in a classroom with people that are capable of doing this. But what's even harder about the argument is to look in the mirror and say, could I be capable of engaging in behavior like this as well? Yes?
I was just going to add, it's like you know so many more ordinary people than you do anyone pathological or extreme. So I think that, you know, like you said, there's like 500,000 ordinary people who would do it. You don't think that I don't think I could find 500,000 extraordinary people that do this.
Yeah. No, I'm so happy both of you to raise both of these points because they're just spot on, they're right on. If we believed that genocide can only be committed by pathological people, we're safer. I mean, it feels good to kind of tuck ourselves in bed at night and feel like I'm really safe from this because I don't know that many pathological people I know of that can do this. Or if we believed, as Dan and Jonah Goldhagen argue, that it could only happen in Germany, then you're just safe if you don't go near Germany, right? So you kind of keep yourself there. Or if it only happens at one point in history, and you don't live in that point of history, you're fine, you're safe. But if you really have to embrace this argument, that it's ordinary people like you and I who do this, you feel a lot less safe. Because ordinary people, as you said beautifully, you interact with every single day. And you look around this classroom, and you look around the community, and you have to ask yourself hard questions about what are these people capable of? But the hardest question is asking it of yourself. Of what am I capable of in a setting like this? You want to be the hero. I mean, you're going to love your time with my friend Carl Wilkins. Carl and I are both from Spokane, Washington. He's a wonderful speaker. I mean, you'll have a great time with Carl. And you'll all leave here wishing you could be Carl in that setting. And you probably would say, in all honesty, boy, if I were Rwanda, I bet I'd act just like him. In truth, if we were all in Rwanda, 90% of us would do what most Rwandans did. We would hide, and we would stand by, and we would just hope it would end. We'd be bystanders. A good number of us would participate as perpetrators if we saw opportunities for it. Very, very few of us would participate as rescuers. I mean, it's just kind of the story as it goes throughout genocide. So this is a hard one to want to embrace, but I think it's important. You're in the process of becoming an educated person here at Sonoma State. Educated people value truth. You hold truth in esteem. Truth is important to you. But sometimes people think all truth is good. That's not what the statement is. Truth is valued. But some truths don't make you feel good about yourself and don't make you feel good about your place in this world. I think this is one of these truths. Ordinary people like you and I do the vast majority of this extraordinary genocidal killing. Does it make me feel good about myself? No. Does it make me feel good about other people in this world? No. But it's realistic, I would argue, and in that realism, we start to have hopes for prevention. Next slide, please. So this is my model, and again, if you look through the book, you've seen this, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but what I tried to do is understand how is it that an ordinary person can become capable of this type of extraordinary evil. And what I try to focus on is not an event. Okay, I'm not looking at one day someone wakes up and they decide to become a genocidal killer. And they get permission to kill and they can do it automatically. I think that very seldom is the story. What I'm looking at is process. A process transformation. How does a person change over time to become involved in atrocity? Okay? Let me pull a composite here for you of several stories from the Holocaust. We can think, for instance, of a guard in Auschwitz. This guard actually existed, was put on trial, and was sentenced to death in Israel. This guard in Auschwitz was just notorious for his brutality. And again, I'm not going to sensationalize it by going into details of what he did and how he did it, but you can imagine the most brutal things imaginable, and this guard was good at it. Okay? It's a simple story, and it's probably appealing to you in all honesty. If this guard, the most brutal guard you can imagine, was for his whole life brutal. Burnt cats as a boy, he just knew he was bad from the beginning. And everything in his life led up to Auschwitz, where he got a chance to be the worst he could be, and he fulfilled it. Incredible. That would be the easiest story. That's the rarest story. The most common story, the complicated, is this is a man who was a teacher in a small elementary school in Bavaria, southern Germany. Not a member of the Nazi Party, almost lost his job because he refused to start class with Heil Hitler when that policy is implemented in his region. A child in his class goes to his parents go to the equivalent of the principal. The principal comes to the teacher and says, I know you're not a member of the Nazi Party, but if you don't start class with a salute, we're going to have problems, and I may have to let you go. So this man decides the next day, half-hearted Heil Hitler salute, get class going, keep my job. What takes him from that to this person at Auschwitz, this notorious guard? I mean, that's the incredible question, right? What's the process that moves him down that road from someone who's a good father, a good husband, a good son, an elementary school teacher, and he becomes this? That process of becoming, this is why I chose the title for the book, Becoming Evil. That process of becoming is the important piece of it to me. That's what we have to understand, because if we can understand the becoming piece, we can stop it. If we know the process, we know places we can intervene to stop the making of these killers. So these are the things I've talked about, and again, we're not going to go into them in great detail. Each of them are a subject, each major section or a subject of a chapter in the book, but these are the things I focus on to understand that process of transformation. The first piece, or what are the cultural characteristics? What is it about a culture that may make it easier to recruit genocidal killers? And I can just give you one example. One of the things I talk about here is authority orientation. When I interview alleged and convicted perpetrators in Rwanda, one of the questions I always ask is, why didn't you disobey? When someone told you to kill, when you heard on the radio to do your work, to kill the cockroaches, why didn't you disobey? And very often the translation has to go from me to French to Kinyarwanda, the native language. Even though English, French, Kinyarwanda, all official languages, most of the people involved in the Interahamwe in Rwanda probably only speak Kinyarwanda. So it goes through these three, and it's interesting that the question about disobeying authority doesn't even really translate into Kinyarwanda. And you see it on their face. They get puzzled. And the translator has a hard time finding the right way to express it, trying to find the right word, because it's just not part of the cultural concept. The cultural concept is you obey authority. You don't question the authority, you don't question the legitimacy of authority, and you don't disobey authority. You obey authority. And this is still true in Rwanda today. If I were speaking to a Rwandan class this size, I could ask them to, stand on their head in the chair. And they probably do it without question. I mean, it's just kind of that cultural obedience. So I think we have to consider some of those issues when we talk about cultures that are capable of producing large quantities of perpetrators. And secondly, the psychological construction of the other. How do the perpetrators come to see their victims? And this is an important point. Come to see their victims in such a way that it's not only right to kill them, but it's actually wrong if you don't kill them. Do you see the difference between those two? I first ran across this in a testimony from a perpetrator in the Holocaust. Trial testimony. Trial testimony is incredibly boring to read through. But you get to this one incredible point where the prosecutor asks this defendant, who's perpetrated atrocities in the Holocaust, how did you come to think it was right to kill Jews? And the defendant has this incredible comment where he says, it's not that I thought it was right to kill them, I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them. You see, that's completely different. It's not just okay to kill you, but I'm actually doing something wrong if I don't kill you. How do we get to that point? There's a philosopher, Amelia Royalty, who has said, the true ethical question has never been whether we may kill, it's always been whom we may kill. You see that? We struggle with whether or not we should kill. The ethical issue is who is it okay to kill? And in perpetrators, they have come to an understanding reinforced by education, by religion, by science, by tradition, by culture, that says it's okay to kill this person. As a matter of fact, it's not just okay, it could be wrong if I didn't kill them. They're so far outside my moral universe of commitment, I've so disengaged myself from them morally that it's perfectly acceptable to kill them, and as a matter of fact, even not acceptable to not kill them in some cases. And then finally, the social construction of cruelty is about, what is it about group dynamics that we need to consider when we talk about perpetrators of genocide. Genocide doesn't happen because I decide by myself to go out and start killing people. Genocide always occurs because I'm part of a group that's involved in the killing process. So what are the group dynamics that we have to understand to help understand my behavior? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but I want to challenge you to try and understand it from this perspective. What perpetrators do is absolutely different from the stuff you do every day. Okay? We'll take that as an assumption. But the group dynamics that influence what they do are the same group dynamics that influence what you do every day. Every day you're influenced by conformity, by peer pressure, by socialization, of wanting to be part of a group, of wanting to be good at what you do in a group. All the things that you deal with in classes and committees, in dorms, athletic teams, drama troops, musical groups, all of those group dynamics, those same things affect perpetrators. Now again, perpetrators end up doing something very different than what you're doing, but they're subjected to the same influences you're subjected to, and we have to understand that. Again, when I interviewed perpetrators in Rwanda who were part of the Interahamwe, many of them came from fatherless homes, broken homes, many of them orphans. And when you interview them about their time in the Interahamwe, it's sentimental. They miss it. Now they'll say the right thing. They'll say, I don't miss the killing, that wasn't right to do, or whatever. But you can see in their face and their responses that they miss the Interahamwe. They miss the brotherhood. They miss the family. They miss the group identification, the things that bound them together as a group. Those things are important. And again, you appreciate this if you have Aaron Rodgers up here standing from the Green Bay Packers saying, the key to our season was camaraderie, it was cohesion, we're all on the same page, and I love these guys like my brother. It's all kind of corny, but still you get caught up in it. There's no difference to think that in a group of perpetrators, somehow the group dynamics play out any differently for them. Again, what they do is different, but the dynamics themselves are still important. So I think if we put all these pieces together, what I've tried to do is come up with a way to help us understand a framework that allows us to understand this process of transformation through which ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. Final couple slides, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. What have we learned and why does it matter? I think one of the things we have to learn is that the age of genocide is not over. We are still concerned, obviously, about genocide in the 21st century, in part because we continue to have huge population growth, and in part because when you have huge population growth, you're going to have scarcity of resources. Okay? Africa is the most conflict-ridden continent in the world today. 7 out of 10 conflicts in Africa are over the scarcity of what? Water. Okay? Some of the things you're drinking in here as we talk. Okay, I have water here at my access. I can't wait to get to. Easily accessible, wonderfully accessible, fresh, cooling. 7 out of 10 conflicts in Africa are over the fact that they can't get that. Or more appropriately, we can't get that to them. We haven't chosen to get that to them. And because of that, conflicts are happening. So rather than think that genocide is something that's going to go away, most people in the field look at the world and say genocide is something that's going to be with us, and it's going to stay with us, and it's something we're going to continue to get a handle on. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of places in the world we're concerned about today. Part of my work with the Auschwitz Institute and part of my work as a scholar and teacher is to try and keep up to date with conflicts throughout the world and where we might see potential genocide hotspots. It's impossible to do. I was telling a group a couple weeks ago, I just wish the world would take a time out and let all of us in the field get caught up with what's going on where, and then you can start beating each other up again. Just take a break. But I mean, in the past month, you've had Burundi, Ivory Coast, and Libya. I mean, it was like every week something new came up that we thought, yeah, I have to get up to speed on this. I have to understand what the origins of conflict are, what the future is, and so on. But here are some countries, 8 countries that we're very concerned about, and we do have actually specific warning signs, or a list of 8 warning signs that we use and we can judge a country on, and these countries score pretty high on each of the warning signs. Democratic Republic of Congo is DRC, Zimbabwe, Somalia, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Rwanda, China, Myanmar, Burma. And again, out of all of these, I'll pick the one I'm most familiar with, but I think it's a good illustration, is Rwanda. The Rwandan genocide happens in '94. How many of you saw Hotel Rwanda? I've seen that, okay? Wonderful movie. At the end of it, the good guys win, the bad guys are vanquished, and all is good. That's not the story of Rwanda. Rwanda today is one of the countries highest at risk for genocide because it never was able to recover from the genocide in '94. So this is one of the issues involved with genocide, is the lingering after effects. When the killing's over, the lingering after effects leave a country at risk. And again, let me focus for a minute just on Rwanda. Rwanda, it's estimated 250,000 women raped in the '94 genocide. Almost all of those women raped multiple times by multiple people in the genocide. The rape had a purpose. Part of the purpose was to infect victims with HIV. And I think about 70% of the 250,000 women raped in '94 did develop HIV. They still continue to die of AIDS and AIDS-related complications today. So when I say to you, the death rate in Rwanda was 800,000 in 1994, that's actually not accurate. The death rate from the Rwandan genocide still continues today because women are still dying from AIDS they contracted during the genocide. Many women in Rwanda, thousands of women, were so brutally abused in the genocide that they developed what are called urogenital fistulas, which basically means that the internal hemorrhaging of gang rape and the brutality of rape with machine guns, with broom handles, with whatever could be found, the brutality was such that they no longer have the physical ability to retain urine and to retain feces. And so they go from village to village and they breathe because their body can't contain its own waste products. Now we can fix that, medically speaking. It's about $2,500 a person. But no one went in Rwanda, where the average person makes about $225 a year. No one has the money to fix a condition like that. It's estimated that upwards of 95% of children in Rwanda in 1994 saw murder. Didn't see it on TV. Didn't hear about it on the radio. But over 95% of children saw someone with their own eyes killed in 94, and in most cases it would have been a family member. What's the future of a country where 95% of its children have been brutalized and victimized in that way, suffer from that type of trauma? Does a country like that ever recover? Can it ever recover? How many generations does it take to erase those memories? And again, this is where it's a little bit different from the Holocaust, where the victim group, Jews, targeted victim group, by and large flee to the US, to Canada, to Britain, to the new state of Israel, and by and large don't have to go back and live next door to the perpetrator. Rwanda, you don't have that opportunity. You have victim and perpetrator literally next door to each other. How does that country heal? We have to learn from Rwanda because it hasn't done it well. And in part it hasn't done it well because the world hasn't given it the support it needs to. So it's heartbreaking to see Rwanda on this list of 8 countries highest at risk. And again, in the past month, as you said in this course, we add Burundi, we add the Ivory Coast, where we're concerned about genocide, and we add Libya, where we're so concerned about mass atrocity that that's already been referred to the International Criminal Court. With an idea of how ordinary people can be made into perpetrators of genocide, doesn't make it unapologetic. It doesn't excuse the behavior. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference on war crimes in London, and my paper presentation was about this point exactly, that you have to be careful of seeing if we can psychologically explain someone's behavior, that doesn't mean it is excused. Understanding is not the same as apologizing. Explaining is not the same as forgiving, so we have to be careful about that. For me, and Myrna hinted at this in the introduction, my interest in understanding perpetrator behavior is I want to stop them from being made. I mean, I want to understand the process so I can know, as someone who works with policymakers and U.S. Army officers, I can know where to step in or where to suggest they step in and make a difference when they start to see a country implementing some of the processes of recruiting people to become perpetrators of genocidal acts. If we can't understand that, we don't have any hope for stopping it, right? I mean, we have to come to some understanding of how to start. So this explains, and this final thing I'll say, and we'll take questions. Part of my work with the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, as I said, 4 times a year, and it's coming up again in April, I go to Auschwitz, and I'm the curriculum developer for week-long seminars that do 3 things. Teach participants what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and what they can do to make a difference. Our participants, and we teach at Auschwitz, so when I teach, I'm in a former prisoner's barracks at Auschwitz I, and our whole week is there at the camps. And there's a power to that place, as you can imagine. To study genocide at Auschwitz is a pretty powerful experience, and it's overwhelming. Some of our groups, this is our group in April, are U.S. Army majors from the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Right now, and maybe this makes you feel better about your place in the world, it makes me feel better, every U.S. Army major, every single one, will come through us at Auschwitz. And they'll learn what genocide is, what the warning signs are, what they can do to make a difference. I sleep a lot better at night knowing that the men and women who lead our troops around the world know what to look for. And just simple stuff. We had one major last September who said we'd gone through one of the exhibitions at Auschwitz and he'd seen the list the Nazis developed of people for deportation. And he just stood at the list and he started crying. And he came back that night, we talked to him in debriefing and talked about his reaction to that list, and he said, I've seen those lists. I've been posted in Africa. I've seen a list like that. I just didn't know what it was for. I didn't know what it meant. But after this program at Auschwitz, he knows what the list is for. He knows what the list means, and he's going to react differently next time he sees it. I think the Development was one of our early programs because the other seminar we do is for government policymakers from around the world. I think we've had 50 3 different countries involved in these seminars. And we had one woman from Burundi, who at the time was a pretty mid-level government official, but as recently as last August was the equivalent of the vice president of Burundi. And she was a wonderful resource for us. The vice president of Burundi, a country in conflict, has been through our program. She knows what to look for. She knows who to connect with. The last we heard from her was in October, when she had to flee Burundi out of fear of her life. And today she lives in Tanzania. We don't often hear from her because she doesn't have capacity to reach out, but she's one of the people in Burundi that we hope can go back in and make a difference. So I think anyone who works in the field, you do so with the idea and understanding that what you're trying to understand and explain is somehow going to make the world better, somehow going to make the world a little bit different. So let me show you, and then we'll have time for questions, a brief 2-minute video clip of some of the work we do at Auschwitz, to give you an idea. And I can't get there, but if you click on that link where it's about this piece. Yeah, if you want to maximize it or whatever magic you can do, thank you.
Genocide has caused the death of more human beings than all the wars and murders in history combined. After the Holocaust of European Jews in World War II, the international community said never again. And yet the bloodshed continues. Guatemala, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Burundi, East Timor, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan. It seems it cannot be stopped. The Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation believes that it can. AIPR is an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization based in the United States and Poland that prevents genocide by identifying and training effective and committed leaders in 3 areas: government, military, and academia. AIPR's newest program brings US Army officers to the Holocaust site of Auschwitz in Poland for 7 intensive days of education and training in the history of genocide and the tools they can use to prevent it. Instructors for Auschwitz Institute seminars are leading scholars and policy practitioners who approach the issue from every angle: history, politics, psychology, diplomacy, international law, media, education, transitional justice, and early warning. For many participants, the highlight of the seminar is the guided study tour of the extermination camps, led by experts from the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, AIPR's valued partner. The impact of this transformative experience cannot be overestimated. As they advance in their careers, some of them going on to become high-ranking commanders, these army officers will carry with them the knowledge that preventing mass atrocities is a critical part of every mission they go on. They will know the warning signs and they will be able to intervene to stop the bloodshed. The Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. We prevent genocide. Go to www.auschwitzinstitute.org to donate now and help us save lives.
Thanks. I'll close with this and then take questions. First, I just realized kind of comfortably that in that video I was wearing the same shirt as this one. I have over this shirt. This must be a favorite one someday. Just watch that in the future. If you're interested in more in the Institute, have any questions, please feel free to ask me. We do use college interns often for a lot of our programs, especially summer programs. So if you're interested in the field of conflict, Holocaust, genocide, peace, reconciliation, human rights, this would be a great opportunity for you. We're a binational office, so the offices I work with are in New York City, Manhattan. We also have offices in Poland because we're associated with the Birkenau State Museum. So I'd be glad to answer any other questions you have about that as well. But why don't we take our final 10 or 15 minutes together to just answer general questions you have about the presentation, about genocide, about anything, and we'll go from there. We'll start here.
So I know that the United States has a pretty vast history of Native Americans
great question. Right now, is the U.S. capable of committing genocide again? 2011. A couple things to say here. One of the things we know that it is an antidote for genocide is a mature democracy. Mature democracies very seldom have war against other democracies and very seldom would involve themselves in mass atrocities. Now the problem is, what does a mature democracy look like? In the late 1800s, our sense of westward expansion and manifest destiny, as we slaughtered tribe after tribe after tribe, we weren't anything like a mature democracy. American citizens and people who lived in our country who weren't citizens didn't have the voices that we tried to develop today in this country. So, in response to your question, is it possible today? I'd say it's always absolutely possible in every country. It's less likely in a country that's a quote-unquote mature democracy, and I think we're close to that. The other side of the government coin, though, is we all get excited about countries who start to become democracies. The most dangerous political system for mass atrocity commission are governments in transition. So when you see a government that's starting to transition from a autocracy or dictatorship into a democracy, that period of transition is absolutely dangerous. I mean, that's where we see a lot of mass atrocities take place. So democracy is not some magic antidote that just takes overnight. And we learned that the hard way in the Middle East, certainly in Afghanistan, but it's that transition period that's dangerous. Now, the more democracies, stable democracies we have, the less war I think we would have. The less war we have, the less likely we'd be for genocide. But I don't think we could ever be so arrogant as to say we live in a country that's incapable of committing this. Our history doesn't support that. Our future is probably less likely, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. Does that help?
Yeah, I have a follow-up. Who do you think would be targeted? Because for me, when you were talking about the other, that really resonated with me, and I took a class. But it resonated with me because America, right after September 11th, we were so patriotic that it was dangerous because it seems like when a country is so adamant that they're the strongest or the best, the binary opposite has to be, well, are we the rightest or the best against who?
Right.
And so, to me, we still have this really big patriotic thing, which is great, but do you think that there's a targeted group that might be because of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I have to be purely speculative in responding to that. I mean, the UN Genocide Convention protects 4 groups: racial, ethnical, national, and religious. The problem with the Genocide Convention is you have all these other groups that could be targeted as the other that aren't protected. Political, social, economic, gender, sexual orientation, ability, disability. None of those groups are protected under the Genocide Convention. Now, if you commit atrocities against them, you're guilty of crimes against humanity, but you're not technically guilty of genocide. So I think, if you look at our country, I think rather than point to a single group, your point's a good one, is how quickly we can define the other. I mean, that's what's fascinating. When you talk to Muslims who lived in America on September 10th, and you ask them what life was like on September 10th compared to what life was like on September 12th, and has been since then, huge difference. And what they're struck by is, we lived here for 2 or 3 generations. Overnight, we became the other. And we don't know if we'll ever do that sense of inclusion back again. So I think one of the striking things is, we can define the other quickly. And once we do it, some of these dynamics of prejudice and persecution can kind of quickly kick in as well. But thank you. Here, there. Yes.
I was in Germany for a year last year to study, and it was a really interesting to be able to speak to people about the Holocaust, and I went to Dachau, and just to know that the perpetrators were still alive, many of them are still alive, and their children now learn what has happened and what perhaps their grandparents have done, and I was just I thought it was interesting of how they learned to deal with and to understand what their country did, and not so long ago, did. And I was curious if you knew any prevention techniques that Germany has implemented, because I know what was curious to me is that their school systems in general organized groups of sorts, and those are all extracurricular, privatized groups, because they don't want to have like a group, that group dynamic and mass conformity. And I was curious if that is a good prevention technique, or if you know of any others that Germany has used that are like successful.
That's a great question. A couple of things in response. One is, Germany is fascinating. I taught in Germany in 90 and 92 at the end of the Cold War. And in 90, when we were first there, Germany won the World Cup in soccer. And it was fast. We lived above the bar. It was just crazy what was going on. But what was fascinating about the German people was they were afraid to really enjoy it.
Oh, yeah.
Because it felt, they were getting excited, then they look around and say, was that too nationalistic? Was that too? Yeah, so they're kind of hesitant about, is it okay for us to raise flags? Is it okay to be proud to be Germany and so on? So that really is one of the issues. I think in terms of prevention, the two notable things that Germany has done is one is they've mandated in all levels of education extensive Holocaust education. Every German and Austrian school child will visit at least one concentration camp or death camp. I mean, it's part of the mandated curriculum. If they miss it for a day, for an absence or sickness, they're going to go the next year with lower grade. I mean, they have to do it. So I think they've been intentional about the education piece. I think they've also been intentional about issues of reparation and repayment. So Germany today still spends billions of dollars in reparations to victims and survivors of the Holocaust and their families. So Germany's been pretty intentional about that, about reconstructing society. They've done some controversial things. Germany denying the Holocaust is illegal. Wearing Nazi paraphernalia is illegal. Those things for you and I sound like they infringe a little bit on freedom of speech, but Germany has said for us to go forward, we cannot allow anyone in this country to deny the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, 13 European countries make Holocaust denial illegal. Again, it sounds a little bit foreign to us because we don't have to think about freedom of speech, but for those countries, they've said, for us to go forward from this has to be how we do it. And I think that's a good question. Here, back there.
From the three influences that you mentioned on your chart, which one, in your opinion, is the most good on the part of the
Is the strongest one?
Yeah.
Okay. Good question. The question was, which of those three influences do I kind of focus on most? This is one of the questions that come up often. And I was telling Mervyn beforehand that I think 2013 we'll have a third edition of Becoming Evil coming out. And one of the things I want to do in the third edition is address just that question. Because I have this range of influences, and I shied off in the second edition from saying these are the strongest ones or most important, or these come first or second, because I just wasn't sure enough. I think in my research over time since then, as I continue to think about it, hear other people's reactions, the definition of the other, the psychological construction of the other, who that person is, that to me is probably central to understanding perpetrator behavior, is you have to understand how they read the victim. And sometimes those understandings run so deep for perpetrators that even years later, it'll still serve us. I'm thinking of a testimony I read of a German Nazi perpetrator in the Holocaust, and he was interviewed in 1970, so mid-70s, 30 years after the fact, and he was apologetic in the interview about what he did, but there was a but. He said, but the Jews really were trying to take over the world. They're still trying to do so today. And he just kind of saw that the mindset that he had developed that made the Jews the other was still there, years after the fact. And that to me kind of speaks to the power of that definition. And this is kind of a preview for your time with Carl Wilkins, part of Carl's whole educational strategy is how can we learn to not think of other people as the other? I mean, how do we expand that universe of people we feel committed to rather than kind of constrict it and keep it decreased? So I think in the third edition of Becoming Evil, that's going to be for me where the discussion of perpetrator behavior starts. How do they view the victim? And then what is the context in which they choose to be involved that kind of socializes them into the process of killing? That's a good question. Yes, sir?
Did you say all the U.S. Army majors are going to doctorate to this class?
Well, every U.S. Army major now goes through the training program at Command and General Staff College. And they call it a program. I don't think this is an official title. I think it's kind of an inside joke. They call the program now No Major Left Behind. So it used to be the U.S. Army, qualified people would rise to the rank of major, and that was the entry into the higher levels. Now my understanding of the U.S. Army structure is that everyone makes major, unless they've been dismissed from the full services. So every major will come for 12 weeks through the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and part of that program will now be that every cohort of that group will come to Auschwitz for a week for these seminars. So
Every cohort was that?
just every group of people that come through the program at Fort Leavenworth.
Every participant?
Yeah.
Every man and woman making major?
Yes.
We'll go
Yep.
to Auschwitz?
We'll go there for a week. Hasn't happened, I mean, this will phase in over time, but it's what the Army's trying to commit to. It was in the Department of Defense budget 2 years ago. It's not back in the budget now, so that's a reason for a little bit of my hesitation. But the plan is that everyone who goes through Fort Leavenworth, part of their education will also be a week at Auschwitz as well.
And why majors?
Just because that's the only place in the Army command structure that they all come together off-site for the education at Fort Leavenworth. Yeah, and again, I apologize, that's as far as my knowledge of Fort Leavenworth goes. But, 3 years ago, the Department of Defense committed to genocide prevention as part of its strategy, and the Department of Defense mandated that all armed forces provide for some type of training for its personnel in genocide awareness and prevention. And the U.S. Army has actually been the one branch of the armed forces that have taken that first step to do this. One final question, or do we need
We have a little question. She promised me. So
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Doctor. I was just curious, you were talking about the authoritarian nature of some of the perpetrators that you interviewed in Rwanda. Is that authoritarian, cultural flavor a symptom that's post-colonial, or is it innate in the Rwandan culture?
Yeah, there's been a lot of debate about that. I think my understanding is that historically in Rwandan culture, it's been part of tribal understandings. The colonial tradition exacerbated it quite a bit, but it's just been part of how Rwandans think about themselves. And again, it's a good question to finish on. I don't at all mean to say that cultures that have some majority orientation are always bad, always produce perpetrators. But what we have to understand is if you're part of a group that comes to power, what type of culture would really allow you to use that power to commit genocide? One of the characteristics would be a culture like Rwanda, like Cambodia, like Nazi Germany came into, where authority is seldom questioned. That's just not a cultural model of how that culture works. And I'll go back to your good question about what makes Germany different. Part of the post-war Germany was this huge cultural swing from a strong authority orientation to a strong anti-authority orientation in West Germany. I mean, just a huge swing in that cultural shift and transition. So I think those are things that are important for us to help understand. So I'm going to finish here by saying, every year, it's one of the favorite things I do is come here and spend time with you. So thank you very much.